Denise Roche.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm predicting that tomorrow's budget will deliver much hardship for many sectors of our community. In the last 3.5 years, over 5,000 jobs have gone from the public service. Jobs have been cut and jobs have simply not been filled. The government may call this efficiency, but what it is a massive reduction in the services that New Zealanders expect, and we can list them. Cuts to biosecurity services that put our primary production exports industry at risk. Cuts to embassies that put our international reputation at risk. Replacing real people with call centres at Housing New Zealand and tax centres. So what happens when those jobs are cut? We know that our public service staff are working harder than ever before. Last year, a survey of women in the public service showed that around 2.5 million hours of extra work was completed by those women. It wasn't paid for. That amounts to $54.5 million worth, or 1,360 full-time jobs, all gifted for free to the state. And tomorrow's budget is likely to result in more job cuts. This is a false economy. Cutting jobs means a reduction in taxes. It means less spent in the economy too. In last year's budget, we also saw a reduction in the amount of money that was allocated to the community and voluntary sector. It dropped by around $11 million. How this reduction plays out in the social service providers is that they get squeezed to supply more for less. The not-for-profit sector frequently picks up the slack when the government pulls back from providing those services directly. We already know that community organisations deliver amazing value. For every dollar they get from the government, they provide at least $5 more. At the Christian Council of Social Services conference last month, we heard from the Finance Minister that the government doesn't really care how those services are provided as long as it's cheap. And we also heard from the CEO of the Community and Family Services Department that they want to deal with big players. Cheap is good and large-scale providers are better. So how do you keep it cheap? You keep the wages low. On average, workers in the community and voluntary sector earn around 15% less than those in the general job market. And we recently heard that there's a discrepancy between what workers in the public service compared to the private sector who are doing caregiving, what they earn, which amounts to discrimination. But hey, it's cheap. Cheap's not good enough. It's not good for the economy, it's not good for public services, it's not good for communities, and it's certainly not good for families. Today, over 60 organisations have formed a broad coalition to launch the Living Wage campaign. These organisations are at the coalface of the impacts of the government's austerity moves, and they're calling for a decent standard of living for all workers. 40 hours a week on the minimum wage brings in $540 a week before tax. And workers earning this are usually subsidised by the government with working for families. That means employers are being subsidised to keep wages low. But even then, thousands of families are struggling to cover the basics like housing, food, electricity, transport and school costs. And many are working several low-paid jobs, up to 70 hours a week, to make ends meet. The difference between the minimum wage and a living wage is that one is really stressful and just getting by, while the other is about getting by with dignity. It's about the ability to provide for your children, to provide for their children, to provide for their families, to contribute to our communities. This government and our government agencies will be called upon to pay a living wage, and not just for those who are directly employed either, but for those who are contracted to provide services, cleaners, security guards, caregivers, and the community and voluntary sector as well. Lifting pay rates in New Zealand for our lowest paid workers will reduce inequality and poverty, and we need to do that or face the fact that we are condemning New Zealand to becoming a society of the haves and the have-nots.
The time for this debate has expired. I call on Government Orders of the Day numbers 1 to 3.